recognize high-class employer and treat your people treat your people on proper way, obviously.
Okay, stressing risks like that, but if you perceive Europe being, let's say, a more stable environment, then there is a question mark over long term. If you are in a matured market, you have the long-term stability in no growth, less return, being confirmed in lower performance. So does that mean that these mature markets are risky in the sense that they are not delivering the returns, or are they less risky than European or the emerging markets with which the return potential you have? So effectively, it's perhaps a little bit too complicated what I said. What I meant is, are you prefer to be safe without volatility but poor, or volatility bumpy ride with more return?
I'll give the easy answer. I want to be somewhere in the middle.
I agree with that.
We certainly don't want to be poor either, and you gotta have to make it's a long-term investment, and you gotta have to continue to invest into the asset as the time goes by. So when we look at those investments, we do think about the longer-term consequences, but it's not so much about necessarily the specific country or specific geographical region. It's more about I think Andy mentioned earlier about the specific airport and the characteristics of that airport and risk around that airport as well. That is it a hub airport, non-hub airport, what kind of airline mix you have, those type of things that really drive our decision. So it's not so much the specific country or is it Europe or is it emerging market.
It comes down to doing the work beforehand, doing the due diligence. So whichever it is, you go in with your eyes open, and you understand what you're investing in. You understand your long-term rationale for that investment, and you understand that the risks and the opportunities. And I think even in perhaps a more mature market that might have relatively low growth, but stability has a value, and it is all about value creation, and it's the kind of, I suppose, the intersection of the skills that your team or you bring as a shareholder kind of aligned with the opportunity, and sometimes they just hit a sweet spot, and it doesn't necessarily, that could be in a high growth scenario, it could be in a low growth scenario. It just depends what opportunity you see and then how you value that. So it's very hard to put hard and fixed rules on it.
And maybe the market is very it's ultimately long term. It's cyclical. So it's how you build that platform and how do you make sure that the financing associated with that specific airport is stable enough to sustain that cyclicality. So as you're a long-term investor, you're not going to worry about if something happens for 1 year, whether it's a hurricane or something else, but you just got to be prepared for the changes coming down the line. And sometimes it's difficult, but ultimately that's what we get paid to do.
And so just to add to that, and I'd like to challenge your view on Europe being a bit safer. You can accept a lower return.
To be stable.
And I think the perception is priced in at the moment, to be honest. I think what we see pricing for European airports does not take into account, and probably in this competitive market can't price it in, but regulatory changes that might be on the horizon. And obviously you're aware of the review of the Airport Charge Directive. And that stable framework, I think, is for any long-term investor such a fundamental point where it's always a dialogue and it's always the debate about charges versus airports and to what extent are airports quite attractive and profitable, and obviously airlines are a very competitive market and that dynamic. I think in order to have the investments in airports and be able to implement sustainability strategies, implement long-term capacity growth, the framework has to be attractive enough to keep long-term investors and to invest more. So in terms of that agenda and addressing the question, we are worried about it, and we're looking at a few European airports at the moment. But it is something, obviously, the dialogue between regulators and the investment universe just needs to be more active and it needs to be more transparent as well.
How do you see in that context then the political discussion here in Europe with regard to climate change and this movement, flight charm? Do you see that being a driver for the regulator and the politicians to change frameworks?
I think it's an interesting point, actually, that regulation perhaps needs to catch up a little bit on that side to incentivize make sure that the investment that we can all see we need to make to hit carbon neutrality and zero carbon and all the good things we need to do to sort of address the issue, that the sort of framework for regulated charges is set in a way that optimizes the incentives to invest in that. I'm not saying it's not necessarily set there at the moment, but I think more can be done to make that more explicit. And that will encourage everything to move a bit faster, potentially, in that area.
Well, it's necessary to communicate more and more on what we do on this aspect. Since we are clearly a target for possible additional tax. This is quite fashion at the moment. And unfortunately, personally, I think that some more tax are coming, despite of all efforts we do with coordinated by ACI. I think that the adjustment of the airport charge rule will not be in our favor. We don't know when. It will reflect on airline fares, clearly. So additional tax will be reflected in the cost of the flight ticket. So more regulation will have an impact on investment, on capacity investment. Could bring to congestion in some big airports. And it will impact growth, because if the airline fares increase, the airline, they will be very happy because we have higher yield, no slots for the competition, but it will impact our traffic.
I guess the flight charm point is a very interesting one, and obviously millennials especially want to be globally connected and visit their friends, but at the same time do that in a sustainable way. I think what we are seeing is that impact is probably more on domestic flights, and I think Sweden is the example where you see 8% drop year to date on domestic travel. And Sweden doesn't have a high-speed network such as other countries, so we are a bit cautious is what portion of domestic travel is at an airport, and how will that sentiment in the population change?
I'm quite concerned by this phenomena because FlixSem, like other fights, it starts to be a kind of romantic fight, but it can become more aggressive with pressure on people. We do not share the same values, and so let's see what happens. But I think this is a long-term trend, and we should pay attention to that.
Which I suppose, to be fair, coming back to the investment point, is all of these issues. Would taxes come in? Will there be changes in European regulation and those sorts of things? Increase the risk for the investor, and risk one way or another gets priced through. And when we look at returns and everything we need, and that is not necessarily the right way to encourage that investment. So kind of getting the right balance is important, of stability that encourages investment in the right things, rather than necessarily just sort of taxes and pricing to try and sort of cap demand, I think.
So does that mean that you are then refocusing your investment appetite into countries where this climate change debate is not happening because it's anyway not relevant there, and that reduces the risk?
No, because I think
that's coming there.
As a company, we take climate change incredibly seriously, both within For Every Hour Group and also within all our assets. So we recognise here to say we're committed to all the sort of commitments around the sort of Paris Agreement, and therefore it's not a case of sort of trying to find a place where it's not going on. I think it's, you want to do the right thing, but you're also in business and you're investing and you need a return. Therefore, you've got to try and see that work together and encourage regulators and encourage everyone to understand how that dynamic works.
relevance for you focused on Europe, where the environment and regulatory environment might be influenced by that debate, or is it as well relevant for you in the US, where Mr. Trump perhaps has a different view of relevance of CO2 emissions?
I think it's, you've got to start with it as a company and what you believe. So if, as a company, if you're sort of accept climate change is happening and something needs to be done about it, and you want to play your part in that, then you take that with you wherever you are in the world. You obviously have to adapt to the local circumstances, but your own principles and your own sort of view on that is where you start.
Like Andy said, we focused on North American market, but ultimately we don't get involved with the politics. We try to do the right thing from the get-go, and ultimately on the political front, it's going to change. Things change. In the US, it's a 4-year cycle or 8-year cycle, but as a long-term investor, you just gotta do the right thing from the get-go yourself and just carry on doing your business. Now it's gonna have consequences down the line, whether it's taxes or those type of things, but ultimately you gotta price it into your investment as well.
So climate change is a point that must be addressed properly in the concession contract too. And such clauses are very important, especially in countries where the risk is high. Like I think about India, Indonesia, Philippines. So when you have to rebuild your airport after a hurricane, so better plan who is paying and what.
So you are driving that even in case that there is no legal or political requirement on that, just to be a front runner and active on that environmental field.
I think so. And what we see from other portfolio companies and construction projects is if you actually think about carbon emission reductions, you usually end up with a more sophisticated solution, which is also at a lower cost. So, we have seen win-win situations where it actually makes economic sense as well, which obviously works for everyone's favor.
Actually, airports are only one part of the emission. The major part are the airlines. How do you support them in their efforts, and are our efforts of relevance compared to their efforts?
I think, as was said yesterday, it's a case of probably working together on a lot of this. I think actually surface access is probably one of the biggest drivers of emissions, which, it's debatable, I suppose, as to whether that's the consumer's responsibility to move to an electric car or something, or whether it's the airport's responsibility or the airline's responsibility because you're providing the opportunity and the reason for them to go to the airport. So it is probably it's a combination of everybody sort of working together. I mean, at Heathrow, with the third runway and the sort of, the license to grow that we're hoping to achieve has, there's a significant plan to make sure that it's a carbon neutral third runway, and, significant surface access targets of hitting, 50% plus beyond 2030 by public transport. But then there's a whole range of things working with the airlines on electric vehicles airside, and particularly around actually employees and staff at an airport, which involves both airport staff and airline staff. That is a significant thing, which is about working together to try and do that in a way that enables growth in airport traffic to be at a minimum, basically, so you can deliver economic growth without necessarily environmental cost is what we're all seeking to try and do.
So do you see as well some other impacts or some other modes of air traffic involving the future of airports, meaning flying taxis or things like that? Short.
Funny you say that. Actually, Melbourne Airport is testing with Uber air taxi. So 2020 will be the first test flight. I think Uber is targeting to be commercial in 2023 on that. I think it probably works in very bespoke situations. And I understand Dallas and Los Angeles are the other test airports for Uber. Obviously, Melbourne Airport is a 19-kilometer toll road to the airport, and it can take up to an hour. I think there's obviously a market if you reduce that to 10 minutes. and that is the case. New technologies and new interruptive or new business models will evolve in the sector.
Self-driving cars, or do you see there as well business opportunities for your airports, or more a threat for your parking income?
Well, I'm sure that's going to change. I mean, the post-millennials don't even want to have a driver's license. So obviously that's one of the risks around, substantial amount of revenue comes from the parking today. But that's certainly something that I think we all recognize that we need to take a look at and do something different on. So
yeah, I think many of these things, there's such rapid development in certain areas, and I suppose the climate change issue is probably, well, potentially is helped by many of those things, and so that may accelerate some of the developments in certainly in electric cars, and that may therefore come with self-driving cars. So as an airport, you've just got to sort of adapt to that. The one thing you can't do, history shows, is just pretend it's not going on and stick to your business model. So you have to embrace that, adapt that, and adapt your business model and approach. I mean, I think the airport ultimately is a hub for a whole range of transportation and other activity, and the way people move around may change a little bit, but it'll still be the opportunity to still be a central hub of that activity. Probably.
But it's not all bad thing. I mean, if ultimately you take New York City, for example, if it was a straight, train going into, whether it's LaGuardia Airport or whatnot, easy access to the city, maybe the traffic would be less on the roads, and that would again help the environment itself. Yes, there will be parking revenue impact, but ultimately that could drive the growth on the passenger side as well. So we're fully supportive of mass transit and those type of things, and getting rid of reducing the parking, even on the back of reducing parking revenue.
And the risk of new technologies for us, I agree, is more on car parking than on airline, because I don't really think that the commercial flight will be replaced by something else massively in the coming years. Maybe on business aviation a little bit, but the car parking, the trend you mentioned, self-driving car, but now more and more people go to the airport with BlaBlaCar or rent a car at Drive Now and leave it at the airport, and so clearly it has an impact on parking revenues, and we need to play a role in this and to control this business because we cannot escape this trend.
It's true, and it makes it very difficult for boards and I mean airport operators, obviously more, to take that view of investment decisions today in an uncertain future, and changes that it's still unclear who is actually going to be the winner of technology changes and disruptive business model changes. I mean, we had one of our airports a recent discussion, a new investment in car parks, and self-driving cars was obviously the obvious question. Should we do it? Will it come? Yes, it will potentially come. And then we looked at, payback period is 5 years. So, we take a view to say, you have to make a decision today, and there's demand for car parking today. But obviously you have in mind, that can change in 5 years. We should be okay on this investment.
But there are potentially as well opportunities in recharging
Absolutely.
The cars, or things like that. Coming to the other part of the non-aviation business as well with regard to CO2 emissions. So we were just discussing before that session here whether it would make sense to buy a bottle of Johnny Walker in Sydney and move it to Europe because you save, I don't know, $1 or whatever. So do you think that is a sustainable CO2 friendly model?
We should buy at Heathrow first of all.
Yeah, I was going to say Hermes, but
I think probably in 10, 20 years, some of those issues may start to become more real. But this is maybe where technology comes in to help, where you can get a situation where if the logistics of moving things around the world becomes, has to be non-essential, has to be sort of controlled in some way, or optimized.
Sorry for interrupting, just jumping into that. I interpret this a way that, let's say, the airports are the displays for Amazon to deliver the whiskey at...
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, the concession model is going to continue evolving, right?
The revenue goes to where you bought it, but actually the physical delivery could be optimized in it might be optimized for the passenger perspective, but equally perhaps increasingly be optimized for the environmental perspective to minimize the environmental impact. That still doesn't change the fact that they want to buy a bottle of whiskey at a great price, and wherever they bought it gets the revenue.
And we need to promote local products. I think the local products are more and more popular in airport shops. And together with our retailer, we should really more and more promote the local products. It's more sustainable. We can communicate on this local wine, local food, and I think it has more potential towards potential than. So traditional products like perfumes, I mean, because now the people, they can more and more compare the price with web application, and not always convinced that it's cheaper at the airports to buy this world brand.
There was a question.
Yep.
Can we just put a little bit the issue of carrying goods?
So.
Is it on? Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
The issue of carrying goods on aircraft in context. The difference between the amount of load carried by people in what they buy in retail stores on airports is probably the difference between whether all the guests on or passengers on a plane at any one point had breakfast before they got on it or not, or whether there were actually 4 more suitcases in the hold or some other freight. So I think we should think more broadly about these things and not jump on the wagon of public rhetoric.
I fully agree. Nevertheless, there's still the question whether it makes sense to have this 1 kilo to move. You're right with the relevance, but the relevance is a question which we as airports have as well, dealing with the airlines burning all that fuel. So even as well the little things might count, and therefore, but you are absolutely right.
At the end of the day, wherever you buy the bottle of whiskey, it's got to move from somewhere wherever the whiskey was produced to where the passenger wants it delivered. There was always going to be a journey involved.
But I mean, if you, again, regardless, I mean, if you think about how the concession side has changed in the last 10 to 15 years, it will change in the next 10 to 15 years again. And you know, when we do strategic sessions and long-term thinking, I mean, you think about the people in that room, it tends to be people, no offense, but between 40 and 65, 75, you know, but people who drive the concession revenue 20 years from now, it's gonna be a different generation. So it's an evolving field itself. It might not lead into reducing, you know, carbon footprint as much as we would like to, but we need to be aware of it.
Okay.
I suppose the point is, perhaps, the carbon footprint point is, what I suppose we have a responsibility as airports and airport investors to look at every part of the chain and every part of the business to try and minimise the carbon footprint where we actually can make a difference, so that you then provide a situation, we provide capacity to, you know, enable growth on planes and travel, and enable people to continue to travel, and for more people to continue to travel. And so that's, you know, I think the kind of ultimate responsibility is to take out the things, you know, so electric vehicles and all the rest, and looking at digital and technology to minimise the carbon footprint where we can, such that the areas where it's harder and it's going to take many more years of technology and aircraft and all the rest to make significant difference doesn't become a barrier to travel.
Okay, so I think we have covered more or less what we wanted to cover, but we would be fine for questions, comments, or further discussions.
Just picking up on the last sort of observation on retail, with the younger travellers actually going for experiential purchase rather than actual material purchase, how do you see your investments responding to that? And the moving away necessary from us older people wanting a bottle of whiskey to perhaps drinking it? Maybe not all at once.
I mean, in our latest development opportunity, we try to make the concession piece more of a showcase where it's continuously evolving and changing, as it's not something that's very stagnant. So it's more of a, not quite a gallery of something, but it's not a place where people actually go as much to buy. But our income comes more on the, not more, but we'll get an income from actually the people who want to display things. People go online and then buy it from online, but we might not be actually selling the real product anymore, but we might be just the agent who's displaying it effectively. So,
yeah, I mean, I think you're seeing, certainly over the last few years, and some of the numbers Olivier put up yesterday, food and beverage, which is to some extent an experiential sort of aspect of it, is been growing strongly, and more the purchase of goods is not as strong a growth market perhaps as it was. Perhaps as we're seeing, certainly in the UK, on the kind of high street, the change in the way people are shopping. And so inevitably the kind of type of commercial offer that is put together at an airport is going to change and adapt to that. It doesn't happen overnight. You don't just jump on a bandwagon and, you've got to be convinced that it's that it's the right investment over a reasonable amount of time, so that the concessionaire can make it work and everyone can make a return. But I think it would just change. I mean, sort of example of that, I mean, at Aberdeen we've just put in first UK airport to put a thing called Therapets, which is basically where there's people walk around with dogs which passengers love. And it apparently really relaxes the passengers. It's something that the US has done.
Yeah, we've done.
And it's never been done in the UK before. And it helps just, it is a nice experience for many passengers, particularly with families travelling. It helps them relax, and that puts them in the right frame of mind to then have a drink and maybe enjoy their time in the terminal. So yeah, it's always changing and adapting. Yeah.
And I think your question goes to the heart of what's the future of airports and what people are going to do at an airport rather than going from A to B. I'm not sure the whole digitalization and who owns the customer has ever been answered or will be answered anytime soon, but I think that the trend is more to think about, as you mentioned, what other activities are there, and will airports actually evolve into cities in its own right, with obviously health centers and gyms and facilities that allow the community at the airport, working at the airport and traveling to use the like. So I think we'll see a lot of different business models depending on the location.
Yeah, I see as well that there's a move to local food, that there's more experience on that stuff, local products, but as well more events, landside as well. For example, in Düsseldorf, we have a regular event there. It might be exposition of things for people living around, but the most spectacular was a ski jumping within the terminal with Eddie the Eagle, things like that. Obviously, that is not a sustainable income stream, but it's a highlight for people. And, we try to manage this, but I fully agree that's a problem, and the next real challenge to ensure that the events and the experiencing should be in the focus, not to lose everything to the Amazons.
I don't know, we embrace the technology, obviously, but ultimately setting up the biometrics, setting up the security to be seamless and flowing through quickly, and then when you match that with potentially seamless transportation to the airport, that will ultimately lead into us having to think about the concession area differently, because if people can fly through the airport, very fast, go through the security, you walk into the terminal, it's a facial recognition, you can walk through the security within 2 minutes, you buy your gate within 5 minutes, then how do you think about people actually spending their money and time? Are they going to show up there then 20 minutes before, or are they going to show up 2 hours before to actually spend the money? So that we do need to think about that longer term. And that is a risk in a business model.
Okay. Any further questions, comments? Then thank you very much. And,
everybody can go home now,
No,
Thank you.
Great job, Holger, and your 4 panelists for actually helping us stay on time and carry on with the rest of the conference. Very, very interesting conversation indeed. So, time for the last coffee break of the conference. Please enjoy it at the exhibition, and let's be back here at 11:50 so we progress. Thank you very much. Well done.